A lot of people think the woods are peaceful. They think that because they've only seen them in the daytime. They've only seen the sunlight coming through the trees, the little patches of blue sky between the branches, the sound of birds, maybe a creek nearby. In the daytime, the woods can feel calm. Safe, even. But when the sun goes down, all of that changes. At night, the woods stop feeling like a place people visit. They start feeling like a place people aren't supposed to be. These are 5 deep woods camping horror stories. This happened to me when I was 21. Back then, I had this weird confidence that only comes from being young and dumb. I'd go on solo camping trips all the time because I liked the quiet. No phone calls, no traffic, no people. Just me, a tent, a small fire, and a few days away from everything. The trip that changed my mind happened in northern Pennsylvania, in a state forest where dispersed camping was allowed. I'd found the area through an online forum. People said it was quiet, remote, and not visited much except by hunters in season. That sounded perfect to me. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon in early October. The air already had that late fall cold to it, and the deeper I drove into the woods, the less I saw any sign of other people. There were old logging roads, most of them barely drivable, and after about 40 minutes of slow driving over rocks and mud, I found a small clearing near a creek and decided to set up there. It was beautiful in a lonely kind of way. Tall trees all around. No cabins. No campsites. No power lines. Nothing but woods. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the evening doing what I always did on those trips. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the creek, and watched the last bit of light disappear between the trees. At some point, I remember thinking how unbelievably quiet it was. Not silent. Just empty. No distant roads. No voices. No music from another campsite. Just the occasional rustle of branches and the creek moving over rocks. By about 10, I put out most of the fire and climbed into my tent. The temperature had dropped fast, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag with a flashlight next to me. I lay there for a while listening to the woods. And that's when I heard the whistling. It was faint at first. Just a few notes. Slow. Casual. I remember freezing the second I heard it, because it was so clearly human. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal making some weird sound. It was someone whistling. At first, I tried to be rational. Maybe another camper had set up farther away than I realized. Maybe the sound was traveling through the trees weirdly. But then I heard it again, and this time it was closer. Same slow, tuneless little whistle. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the roof of the tent, telling myself not to panic. The smart part of my brain was trying to explain it, but the rest of me already knew something was wrong. Nobody should have been that close to my campsite without me hearing them approach. After maybe 30 seconds, I slowly reached for my flashlight. The whistling stopped. That was somehow worse. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps. Not loud. Just soft crunches in the leaves outside the tent. One step. Another. Slowly circling. My throat went dry. I remember gripping the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. I said, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps stopped near the back side of the tent. Then, after a few seconds, I heard that same whistling again, right behind me. Not 10 feet away. I didn't say anything this time. I just stayed frozen, staring at the nylon wall like I could somehow see through it. The whistle went on for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped mid-note. Then silence. The kind of silence where you know someone is standing there listening. At that point, I was considering unzipping the tent, grabbing my knife, and yelling at whoever it was to get lost. But something stopped me. I think it was the feeling that whoever was outside wanted me to do exactly that. Instead, I clicked off the flashlight and tried to make it seem like I was asleep. A minute passed. Then 2. Then I heard the footsteps move away from the tent. I let out the smallest breath of relief. Then I heard them near the fire pit. I could tell by the sound of boots moving around the rocks there. And then I heard something that made my stomach drop. The metal grate from my small camp stove got picked up and dropped. Whoever it was wasn't just passing by. They were touching my stuff. At that point, I grabbed my truck keys and quietly slid them into my pocket. I also had my phone, though there was no signal out there. I decided if the person tried anything, I was making a run for the truck. Then I heard them walk back toward the tent. And suddenly a voice said very softly, "I know you're awake." I can still hear that voice if I think about it too much. It was calm. Almost amused. I stopped breathing. A few seconds later the voice said, "You shouldn't camp alone out here." I didn't answer. Then the person laughed under their breath. Not a loud laugh. More like a little exhale through the nose. Then the footsteps moved away again. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. I have no idea how much time actually passed. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe an hour. I just lay there listening. Eventually, I heard nothing. No footsteps. No whistle. Nothing. I told myself maybe the person had left. But I didn't believe it. Finally, I decided I was done waiting. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, holding the flashlight off, and crawled halfway out. The fire was almost dead, but there was enough moonlight to make out the clearing. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then I turned toward my truck. And saw a person standing beside it. Just standing there in the dark, one hand resting on the driver's side door. I dropped flat to the ground without thinking. I don't know if they saw me or not, but I stayed pressed into the cold leaves, barely breathing. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. The person didn't move for several seconds. Then they slowly walked away from the truck and disappeared into the trees. That was enough for me. I crawled back into the tent, grabbed my bag, and shoved whatever I could into it without caring about the noise. Then I ran for the truck. When I got there, I saw something that made my hands start shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. All 4 of my tires had been slashed. Clean cuts. Not one. All 4. I remember just standing there for a second, staring at them, feeling this wave of pure helplessness. Then behind me, somewhere in the trees, I heard the whistling again. Much farther away this time. Like the person was letting me know they were still there. I left everything. Tent, food, gear, all of it. I locked myself in the truck and spent the rest of the night sitting in the driver's seat with the doors locked, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The whistling came and went until maybe 3 in the morning. Sometimes close. Sometimes far. Once I heard footsteps circle the truck. But nobody tried the doors. When daylight finally came, I got out and hiked almost 4 miles until I found enough signal to call for help. A ranger came out with a tow truck later that morning. I told him what happened, and he got this look on his face that I didn't like at all. He asked me exactly where I had camped. I showed him on a map. Then he told me there had been reports over the years of someone harassing campers in that section of the forest. Slashed tires. Missing gear. Strange noises at night. Never caught. He said most people assumed it was some local drifter or hunter messing with people. I asked if anyone had ever been hurt. He paused, then said, "Not officially." That word stuck with me. Not officially. A week later, after I got home, I realized something else. When I packed for the trip, I'd brought one of those disposable cameras with me. I'd used it during the drive and around camp before dark. After getting the photos developed, most were normal. Trees. My tent. The creek. But the very last photo on the roll was one I never remembered taking. It was from inside my tent, pointed outward through the mesh screen before nightfall. And between two trees near the edge of the clearing, almost blending in with the shadows, there was a man standing there. Just watching my campsite. Which meant he'd been there long before the whistling started. And maybe long before I even noticed I was alone. A few years ago, my cousin Drew, my friend Alan, and I decided to do a 2-night camping trip in the Adirondacks. The plan was simple. Hike in, camp near a small lake, fish, drink a little, and hike back out the next day. We weren't hardcore survival guys or anything. Just 3 people trying to get away from work for a weekend. We started late, which was our first mistake. By the time we parked and got onto the trail, it was already after 4 in the afternoon. The weather was good, but once you're deep in the woods, light disappears faster than you think it will. The trail was supposed to be easy enough, and according to an old forum post Drew had found, there was a decent unofficial campsite about 5 miles in near the lake. We brought headlamps, food, tents, all the usual stuff. The hiking was fine at first. We talked, joked around, stopped for water a couple times. But the deeper we got in, the less maintained the trail looked. There were fallen branches across it, old faded trail markers, and stretches where it barely looked like a trail at all. Alan said, "You sure this is the right way?" Drew checked his phone even though we didn't have service. "It's the route I downloaded. We're fine." By the time it started getting dark, none of us felt as confident. The woods out there were thick, and once the sun dropped behind the trees, everything turned gray and then black. We switched on our headlamps and kept moving, but the trail kept getting harder to follow. Finally we found the lake, or what we assumed was the lake, because we could see water through the trees. We also found an old fire ring and a small flat area, so we decided that had to be the campsite. We set up fast. By then, all 3 of us were tired and irritated. The mood had changed from fun to just wanting to eat and get to sleep. We made some dehydrated food, sat around a small fire, and listened to the forest. At one point Alan said, "Do you hear that?" We all went quiet. I heard what sounded like a voice in the distance. Not clear words. Just the shape of speech. Drew said, "Probably another group across the lake." That made sense, so nobody thought too much of it. But about 10 minutes later, we heard it again. Closer. This time it sounded like a woman calling out something. We all looked at each other. It was one of those things where your brain wants to fill in the blanks. It sounded almost like someone yelling. "Hello?" Alan stood up and shined his headlamp toward the trees. "You guys hear that, right?" I did. So did Drew. "Maybe somebody's lost," I said. Drew frowned. "Or messing around." Then the voice came again. "Hello?" Clear this time. It came from the direction of the trail we'd hiked in on. Alan immediately called back. "Hey!" The woods went quiet. Then the voice answered. "Help!" It was far enough away that it sounded strange, flattened by distance and trees, but it was definitely there. None of us knew what to do for a second. A woman alone in the woods at night asking for help wasn't something you ignore. But there was also something weird about it. The tone never changed. It didn't sound panicked. It didn't sound like crying or screaming. "Just help," Drew said. "That's creepy." Alan grabbed his flashlight. "So what, we just sit here?" I said. Maybe we all go together. Drew was already shaking his head. No. That's exactly how people disappear. Alan laughed once, but it was nervous. What, like some horror movie setup? Nobody answered. Then the voice said, Please help me. Same tone. Same volume. Almost the exact same way. That was what got to me. It didn't sound natural. Not because it sounded fake exactly. More like it sounded repeated. Like a recording. Drew lowered his voice. Do not answer again. Alan looked annoyed, but he listened. For the next minute or two, we just sat there in silence while the voice kept calling every now and then. Hello? Please help me. Hello? It never got much closer, but it didn't move away either. Eventually it stopped. None of us felt like sitting by the fire anymore, so we put it out and got into our tents. Drew and I were sharing one tent. Alan was in his own a few feet away. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up because Drew was gripping my arm. I whispered, What? He put a finger to his lips. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the trail near our tents. Not crashing through brush. Not random animal movement. Human footsteps. I could see a faint light moving through the tent fabric. Someone had a flashlight. The beam passed over our tent once, then moved away. A few seconds later, Alan whispered from his tent. Guys? I whispered back. Yeah. Drew didn't say anything. The footsteps stopped. Then a woman's voice, much closer now, said, Can you help me? It was right outside the tents. Not screaming. Not desperate. Just calm. Almost polite. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. Nobody answered. A few seconds passed. Then the same voice said, I think I'm hurt. Still no answer. Drew leaned close to my ear and whispered, There's more than one. The second he said that, I realized he was right. I couldn't hear them clearly, but there were little sounds around us. Shifting leaves. Soft movement. More than one person. I held my breath and listened. Then a different voice, a man's voice this time, whispered from somewhere farther back in the trees. They're awake. Everything in me went cold. Alan must have heard it too because he said, a little too loudly, Who's out there? Immediately, footsteps moved away from the tents. Fast. Not running full speed, but retreating. Then silence. After that, nobody slept. We stayed in the tents until the sky started getting lighter, and the second it was bright enough to see, we packed up in record time. Alan came out looking pale. He said he'd seen a flashlight beam pause outside his tent during the night, about chest height, like someone was just standing there looking in. We got out of there as fast as we could. About a mile back down the trail, Drew suddenly stopped and pointed at a tree. There was a speaker zip-tied to it. A small portable Bluetooth speaker, half hidden behind the trunk. Alan said, No way. Drew walked up and looked at it without touching it. Then he pointed to the ground. There were footprints all around the tree. And beside the speaker, tucked into the roots, was a little power bank connected by a cable. Someone had set it up there on purpose. We just stared at it. The woman calling for help had been coming from a speaker. Alan said, So they were trying to lure people off trail? Drew nodded once. That seemed obvious. What bothered me more was the part after that. The voices near our tents had been real. Which meant the recording was only to get attention. Once it worked, the people behind it moved in close. We hiked straight out, and when we got back to the parking area, we reported it. The ranger took it seriously enough, but I got the feeling he wasn't shocked. He asked where we'd been and if we'd followed any voice into the woods. That exact question. As if he already knew that trick. Nothing ever came of it, at least not that I heard. But months later, Drew sent me a news link about a hiker found injured miles off trail in the same forest. He survived, but he told authorities he'd heard someone calling for help at night and gone looking. He said after that, he remembered almost nothing except waking up at the bottom of a rocky slope with his backpack missing. I still think about how close we came to walking toward that voice. And what would have happened if one of us had gone alone? Because whoever those people were, they had a system. A speaker on the trail. Voices in the dark. And enough patience to stand outside our tents in the middle of nowhere, waiting to see who would unzip the flap first. This one happened to my girlfriend Melissa and me when we went camping in West Virginia. We weren't deep backcountry campers. We stayed at state parks and established campgrounds most of the time. This trip was supposed to be easy. One of those drive-in campgrounds where every site has a fire pit, a picnic table, and enough distance from the next site to feel private. We picked a campground that looked pretty remote online, tucked into the mountains and surrounded by dense forest. Reviews said it was quiet and not crowded after summer ended. That part was true. When we arrived on a Thursday evening in mid-September, there were maybe 4 occupied sites in the whole place. We checked in at the little ranger station, got our assigned spot, and drove over. Our site was near the far end of the campground loop, with one empty site on the left and woods on the right. The empty site next to ours was the first thing Melissa noticed. There was a tent there. Not a nice one. Just an old dome tent, faded blue, already set up. There was also a cooler, a folding chair, and a dead fire pit full of ash. But no car. No people. Melissa said. That's weird. I shrugged. Maybe they went hiking. That seemed normal enough, but as we were setting up our own tent, I kept glancing over there. The site looked wrong. The chair was knocked over. The cooler lid was half open. And the tent door was unzipped just enough to show darkness inside. Not enough to see anything. Just enough to make it look like someone left in a hurry. Around sunset, I walked to the bathroom building and past the camp host's trailer. I mentioned the empty site to him casually and asked if someone was staying there. He looked past me toward the far end of the loop. Then he said, Supposed to be, yeah? Supposed to be? He gave a little shrug. Guy checked in yesterday. Haven't seen him today. I said, Maybe he went into town. Maybe. The way he said it didn't make me feel better. That night, Melissa and I had dinner by the fire and tried not to think too much about the empty campsite. Once it got dark, though, it became hard to ignore. Our fire lit up part of it, and every now and then I'd glance over and see the open tent flap moving slightly in the breeze. At some point Melissa asked, Can you just go look? I laughed. At what? I don't know. Just to make sure there's not, like, a dead body in there. The way she said it made me laugh, but only for a second. Because I'd already had the exact same thought. I told her I'd check in the morning if nobody showed up. Around 11, we put the fire out and got into our tent. Maybe an hour later, I woke up because Melissa was sitting up. What? I whispered. She said, Listen. I listened. At first I heard nothing. Then I heard movement from the empty campsite. A soft rustling. Then the sound of the folding chair scraping across the dirt. I said, Maybe they came back. Melissa whispered, Then where's their car? Good question. We lay there listening. The noises continued for maybe 30 seconds. A cooler lid opened and shut. Something metal clinked against something else. Then it stopped. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Moonlight lit up the campground loop, pale and thin. The campsite next to ours looked empty. The chair was upright now. That stopped me cold. I knew for a fact it had been knocked over earlier. I stared for another few seconds, then zipped the tent back up. Melissa whispered, "Well?" "The chair's standing up." "What?" "I don't know." Neither of us slept much after that. In the morning, we looked over again. The chair was still upright. The cooler was closed now, too. And the tent flap was zipped shut. Melissa said, "Nope. Absolutely not." I walked to the camp host again and told him what we heard. This time he seemed more concerned. He came back with me to look at the site. He called out a few times. No answer. Then he slowly walked up to the tent and unzipped it. He immediately stepped back. My stomach dropped. "What is it?" I said. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked at us and said, "It's empty." That should have been good news, but it wasn't. Because inside the tent were a sleeping bag, a duffel bag, and a wallet. The guy's wallet. ID cards, cash. Everything. The camp host called a ranger. 2 rangers showed up maybe 20 minutes later and searched the area around the campsite. One of them asked us questions about the noises at night. Another went through the missing camper's stuff. They found his phone too. Still in the duffel bag. The ranger asked, "Did either of you actually see anyone?" We both said no. He nodded but didn't look convinced of anything. They ended up closing off that campsite and told us we could move to another part of the campground. We did. By evening, the whole thing already felt surreal, like maybe the camper had wandered off drunk or gone on some bizarre hike without his wallet and phone. Then, after dark, we heard something again. Only this time it didn't come from the empty site. It came from the woods behind it. A voice. A man's voice. Very faint. Melissa grabbed my arm and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I did. It sounded like someone saying, "Hey." Just once. Then nothing. A little while later, we heard it again. "Hey." I went straight to the ranger station and told them. 2 rangers came back with flashlights and a radio. They listened for a while, but of course by then the voice had stopped. One ranger said it could be sound carrying from another area. Maybe. But the next morning, they found something. There was a narrow path behind the missing man's campsite leading into the woods. Not an official trail. More like repeated foot traffic through brush. About 40 yards back, they found an old concrete foundation from some long-gone structure. And near it, they found the missing camper's shoes. Just his shoes. Placed side by side. No sign of him anywhere else. Melissa wanted to leave immediately, and honestly so did I. We packed and went home that day. A month later, I looked up the case online. The man had never been found. No blood. No evidence of an animal attack. No confirmed tracks. Nothing. Just an abandoned campsite, a wallet and phone left behind, and his shoes found near an old foundation in the woods. But the part that has always bothered me most happened after the trip. While unpacking the car, I found something in our camping bin that didn't belong to us. A campground map. Not strange by itself, except we already had our own. This one had been folded differently, like someone else had used it. And on the back, written in black marker, were 4 words. He came back after dark. I never told Melissa about that part. Because if that note was already in our stuff, then someone had to have been close enough to our campsite to put it there. And if the note was true, then whatever was moving around that empty site the first night might not have been some random stranger. It might have been the man who was missing, or something pretending to be him. When I was 27, I went on a camping and hiking trip by myself in Oregon. It wasn't a survival challenge or anything dramatic. I just wanted a few days alone. I'd recently gone through a breakup, my head was a mess, and I thought getting out into nature might help. I chose a trail system in a national forest that had a lot of backcountry sites and a reputation for being quiet. I printed maps beforehand, packed carefully, and told my brother exactly where I was going. The first day was uneventful. I hiked about 7 miles, found a designated site near a creek, and stayed there overnight. The second day was when things started going wrong. I took a side trail I thought would loop back toward another camping area marked on the map. But after a couple hours, it became clear the trail wasn't maintained anymore. Fallen trees blocked parts of it, and some sections vanished entirely into undergrowth. I should have turned around sooner. Instead, I kept going, thinking I'd reconnect with the main trail. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. Not movie-level lost, where I was panicking and drinking creek water with my hands. But definitely lost enough that I had no idea exactly where I was. I still had plenty of gear, food, and daylight, so I decided not to do anything stupid. I'd find a place to camp, then figure it out in the morning. As the light started fading, I found something I wasn't expecting. A cabin. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by fir trees, maybe 50 yards off what used to be the trail. It looked old. Very old. Not abandoned in the collapsing sense, but not maintained either. The wood siding was gray with age. One window was boarded up. The roof sagged a little in the middle. There was no smoke, no vehicle, no sign that anyone lived there. Still, it was shelter. I walked closer and called out, "Hello?" No answer. I tried again. Nothing. The front door was shut, but not locked. I pushed it open a few inches and looked inside. A single room. Dusty. Sparse. A small table, a rusted stove, shelves, and in the back, what looked like a cot. No electricity. No food. No personal items. Just emptiness. I know some people would have walked away right then, but the sun was going down and the temperature was dropping, so I made the decision to stay there for the night. I didn't love it, but it beat sleeping lost in the open. I didn't go fully inside at first. I sat on the porch step, ate a protein bar, and checked my map again, hoping the cabin might be marked somewhere. It wasn't. That bothered me more than it should have. You'd think an actual structure in the middle of the forest would appear on a map. But there was nothing. Eventually it got dark enough that I brought my pack inside and laid out my sleeping bag on the floor near the wall. I kept my headlamp on low and my knife nearby. The cabin smelled like old wood, dust, and something else. Something sour beneath it. I tried not to think about that. For a while, it was actually calm. The wind moved through the trees outside, the cabin creaked every now and then, and I remember feeling a little embarrassed at how nervous I'd been. Then I heard the first knock. 3 soft taps on the outside wall. I sat up immediately. The sound came from somewhere to my right, not the door. Just the wall. I listened. Nothing. I told myself it was a branch moving in the wind. Then it happened again. 3 taps. Same spot. Not random scraping. Deliberate knocking. I got to my feet and aimed the headlamp toward the wall as if that would help somehow. The cabin was still. Then, from outside near the back, I heard footsteps in the leaves. Slow steps circling the building. I called out, "Hello?" The footsteps stopped. No answer. A second later, I heard them continue. I moved to the window and lifted the edge of the dirty curtain. My headlamp reflected off the glass, so I switched it off and waited for my eyes to adjust. At first all I saw were trees. Then movement. Someone passed behind a trunk at the edge of the clearing. Just a dark shape, human-sized. I stepped back from the window. My brain immediately went to normal explanations. Another hiker. Hunter. Landowner. But then why circle the cabin without saying anything? I said louder this time. I'm armed. It was a lie, unless you count a camping knife. No response. A full minute went by. Then came a voice from outside. A man's voice. Low and rough. You shouldn't be in there. I didn't answer. The voice came again, from a different side of the cabin. That's not your cabin. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, but going outside felt worse. I said, I'm leaving in the morning. Silence. Then the man laughed. Not a normal laugh. More like one short burst. And then, from much closer, almost right outside the door, he said, You won't. I backed away so fast I almost tripped over my pack. Then the doorknob rattled. Hard. I grabbed the handle from the inside and held it. The other person twisted it again, once, twice, then stopped. A few seconds later, footsteps moved off the porch. I stood there for what felt like forever, not moving, barely breathing. At some point, I heard the footsteps again, farther away. Then nothing. I don't remember sleeping. Maybe I drifted off at some point from exhaustion, because the next thing I remember was gray morning light filling the cabin. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything. Then I looked at the door. There were fresh scratch marks around the handle. Long, deep gouges in the old wood. I packed in under 2 minutes and got out of there. In daylight, the clearing looked smaller than I remembered. I kept glancing around, expecting to see someone watching from the trees. On my way out, I noticed something behind the cabin I hadn't seen the night before. A second structure. Or what had once been one. Just a collapsed shack or shed, almost gone under vines and brush. Something white caught my eye in the debris. I wish I'd kept walking. Instead, I stepped closer. It was a sign. Old, weathered, half-buried, but still readable. It said, Fire Lookout Access Closed Unsafe Structure. Below that, almost faded completely, was a date from the 1980s. That confused me because the cabin I'd slept in wasn't a fire lookout. It wasn't elevated. It wasn't even in good enough shape to still be standing if it had been abandoned that long. I hurried until I found the main trail again around noon. Later that day, after I reached my car, I stopped at a ranger station and told them about getting lost and spending the night in an unmarked cabin. The ranger I spoke to asked where I'd seen it. I showed him on the map as best I could. He looked at the spot, then looked back at me. There's no cabin there, he said. I thought he was kidding. He wasn't. He pulled out a more detailed map and showed me the area. There had once been an old fire lookout access route, he said, but the structures were removed decades ago after storm damage and safety concerns. I told him I had literally slept inside a cabin there the night before. He frowned and said maybe I found some illegal hunting shack. That was possible, sure. But then I described the sign behind it. His expression changed. He asked exactly what the sign said. I told him. He went quiet for a second, then said that sign had been reported missing from a storage yard more than 10 years ago. I didn't like where that conversation was going, so I left. Back home, I cleaned out my backpack. At the very bottom, under my spare socks, I found a photograph I had never seen before. Black and white. Very old. It showed 3 men standing in front of a wooden cabin in the woods. The cabin. Same porch. Same slanted roof. Same boarded-up window. Written on the back in faded pencil were the words, "Last night here before demolition." I still have that photo. And the one thing that keeps me up sometimes is this. I never went behind the cabin far enough to search through the debris. So I never found out whether the structure I slept in was real and old, or if it had no business being there at all. This last story happened when I was 16. My best friend Tyler had convinced me, him, and 2 other guys from school to do a weekend camping trip in a forest area about an hour outside our town. We were too young to understand how unprepared we were, and just old enough to think we knew everything. There were 4 of us, me, Tyler, Evan, and Chris. Tyler's older brother dropped us off near an access road on a Saturday afternoon. The plan was to hike to a clearing Tyler claimed he knew about because his uncle had camped there years ago. The clearing did exist, but it was farther than Tyler remembered. By the time we found it, the sun was already going down. We set up 2 tents, made a fire, and started doing what dumb teenage boys do when they're unsupervised in the woods. Telling stupid stories, trying to act tough, throwing sticks into the fire, talking louder than we needed to. It felt fun for the first couple hours. Then around 10 or so, we heard someone clap. Just once. From the woods beyond the clearing. All of us went quiet. Tyler laughed and yelled, "Hello?" No answer. Chris said, "Probably another camper." Evan looked uneasy. "Why would they just clap?" Good question. Nobody had an answer. A few minutes later, after we'd half convinced ourselves it was nothing, we heard it again. 1 clap. Same direction. This time it sounded a little closer. Tyler stood up and shined his flashlight into the trees. "Knock it off!" Still nothing. That should have been our cue to pack up and leave, but we were teenagers. Leaving would have meant admitting we were scared. So we stayed. Not long after that, the fire started dying down, and Chris and I went to collect more wood from the edge of the clearing. We didn't go far. Maybe 20 feet into the trees. That's when Chris froze. He whispered, "There's someone there." I looked where he was looking. At first I didn't see anything. Then I saw a face. A man was standing behind a tree, peeking out just enough that one side of his face was visible in the flashlight beam. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared at us. Chris yelled and stumbled backward. I dropped the wood and ran with him back to the fire. Tyler and Evan jumped up, asking what happened. We told them there was a guy watching us from the trees. Tyler grabbed the biggest branch near the fire and actually started toward the woods. Chris and I stopped him. I remember saying, "Are you insane?" Then we all heard footsteps moving around out there. Not approaching. Just circling. Tyler called out, "Who are you?" No answer. Then from the dark, a man's voice said, "You boys shouldn't be here." It sounded old. Not elderly exactly, but worn down. Scratchy. Tyler tried to sound brave. "This is public land." The voice answered, "Not this part." Evan whispered, "Let's just get in the tents." That's what we did. We killed the fire most of the way and got inside the tents, 2 in each. I was with Chris. Tyler was with Evan. From inside the tent, every little sound felt amplified. Twigs snapping. Leaves crunching. Wind moving the fabric. For about half an hour, nothing happened. Then we heard footsteps close by. Then a hand dragging across the outside of Tyler and Evan's tent. They both shouted, and the sound immediately moved away. Chris was breathing so hard I thought he might throw up. Then the voice came again, now somewhere between the two tents. I know your names. Nobody said anything. The voice said, Tyler. Then, after a pause, Evan. Then a longer pause. Then, Chris. Then finally, and you. He said my name last. I can't really describe what that felt like. It wasn't just fear. It was a kind of sick confusion. Because none of us had said each other's names out loud since hearing the clapping. And even before that, I was pretty sure nobody had. Chris started whispering. How does he know? How does he know? Then the man laughed softly and walked away. We heard him moving through the clearing, then into the woods again. None of us slept. At some point after midnight, Tyler whispered from the other tent. When it gets light, we run. I said, yeah. The worst part of the night happened just before dawn. I was still awake when I heard a zipper moving. Slowly. Not ours. The other tent. Then Evan shouted, and Tyler started yelling too. Chris and I burst out of our tent, and in the gray morning light I saw the other tent's door had been unzipped about halfway from the outside. Nobody was there. The woods around us looked empty. That was enough. We packed almost nothing. Just grabbed our backpacks and left the tents, sleeping bags, food, everything else. We started hiking back as fast as we could, barely talking. About 10 minutes into the hike, Chris said, Stop. Nailed to a tree beside the trail was one of those cheap school photo prints. It was Tyler's sophomore picture. Same one from the yearbook. We all stared at it. Tyler went white. About 100 yards later, there was another one. Evan's. Then Chris's. Then mine. One by one along the trail out. All school photos. All nailed to trees. I remember Tyler saying, in this tiny voice, What the hell? We started running. Actually running, backpacks bouncing, branches hitting us in the face. Eventually we got back to the access road, and by some miracle Tyler's brother showed up not long after. We must have looked insane when he saw us. We told adults. Police were contacted. They searched the area. Nothing came of it. No man found. No explanation for the pictures. For a while, everyone assumed it was some local creep messing with us. That was bad enough. But the part that made it worse happened later. About 2 weeks later, I got an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was my school photo. The same one that had been nailed to the tree. On the back were the words, You were the only one who looked back. I never told the others about that note. Because it was true. On the hike out, once, just once, I had looked over my shoulder. And for a split second, deep between the trees, I thought I saw a man standing there, watching us leave. Not chasing us. Not hiding. Just standing completely still. Like he already knew where we lived. So, these were the stories sent for today's video. Let us know in comments which story scared you the most. Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. If you want to share your story with us, send us at belladarktales@gmail.com.